Good morning, everybody. This is Diggs. It's another beautiful day out here in the Pacific Northwest, and we have another pretty chunky video for you guys that's going to go a little bit math heavy. We're going to be talking about critical damage. Let's go ahead and dig in. So if you haven't already, it's very important that you understand critical hit rate before you come to this video. It's going to be talked about a lot as we're going through this video, and we're going to be kind of talking about at the end whether or not critical hit rate and critical damage is worth it as a stat to invest in, and when you shouldn't. Specifically in this video, we're going to talk about how to calculate a pre-modified attack. Then we're going to talk specifically about modifiers. So pre-modified attack is going to be like where you would get your base attack value from for a character. Then we're going to talk about stat modifiers. So this would be job specific modifiers, which are separate than normal modifiers. Then we'll be talking about normal modifiers, which critical hit damage falls under, how they apply, how they stack together, and how they kind of create the total damage that you will deal. A couple notes here. We're going to be covering the first side of kind of the damage equation. If you want to know how to calculate the full amount of damage that your character will do, I will leave a link down in the description below. It's from Fall of Green, who is someone who has done a lot of work with the damage calculation formula and who has created the damage calculator. He's also someone I've talked to before, and I'm very grateful for the work that he's done. If you want a full video detailing damage calculation, let me know down in the description, because it does get pretty complicated and it's something I don't even have a full grasp on in terms of the defensive side of the equation. Now, let's go ahead and talk about how you calculate kind of how much raw damage you're going to do, right? So assuming this is a physical attack, right? We're going to take a character's attack value, right? Now, this is the attack value the character has before they attack. So this would be, you know, if buffs are there, mastery abilities, vision cards, all of that attack stat. We're going to take that total attack stat, and then we're going to apply what's called the quote unquote skill bonus, or what I call the stat bonus. Now, the stat bonus is the modification to damage you get depending on the job skill that you're using. For example, different jobs have different modifiers to all of their abilities that you might not know about. And here's an example of this. So for calculators, magic is their primary stat that they're based on, but their damage gets a 15% increase, a 10% increase, and a 5% increase from dexterity, agility, and luck. And a lot of people don't realize this, right? When we talk about how dual gunners or ranged units attacks are modified by dexterity, if you take a look down here, a dual gunner's attack is going to be modified by attack, but it has a 25% mod based off of dexterity. There is a lot of things going on here, right? And this is kind of before any modifiers are added into the damage equation. This is just kind of the raw stats of your character. So if you really want to maximize your damage and kind of understand damage as a whole, you first need to understand what the stat modifiers are for the job that you're using. And I think this is something a lot of people don't know about, and this might be worth doing a separate video on all on its own, just because of the amount of people who do not know what the stat modifiers are for the jobs they're using. For example, calculators getting a bonus from dexterity, that would definitely explain why Ildira's VC has so much dexterity on it. It definitely kind of lends some justification there, right? So once you do that, once you kind of find your stat bonus and you apply it to the basic attack value, you are going to find modifiers. The big question here is, what is a modifier? What counts as a modifier? Essentially, everything counts as a modifier that we think of as really good bonus damage, right? So that's going to be like plus slash attack, plus magic attack, plus wind element, a critical hit, plus critical damage, assuming that you do land a critical damage, man eater, aquatic killer, right? Like all of these are going to follow or fall under modifiers. There are a few things in terms of calculating damage on the defensive side that do matter, but for right now, in terms of kind of seeing how critical damage works, all you really need to understand is that modifiers modify attacks. And probably the biggest modifier that a lot of people don't think of as a modifier is the percentage of the attack that you're doing. So this would be when you are on WoTV calc, for example, and WoTV calc says that the attack is 165% modifier, right? Or it doesn't even say modifier, it just says 165%. So that means the base modifier that attack that character is using, let's say, you know, it's, I don't know, a 220% attack, right? Which is really powerful. It would mean that the base modifier for your character is 2.20. So that means your attack, or your base attack after the stat modifier, is going to be multiplied by this ability modifier with all of the other modifiers added on to it. So if you had slash attack plus 30, for example, that 220% modifier would suddenly be 2.5% modifier, right? So it's additive. All the modifiers are additive, and all of them kind of multiply against the base attack. So plus 35 slash attack is equivalent to, say, plus 35 elemental attack, right? In terms of modifiers. Now, what is critical hit as a modifier? Well, if you score a critical hit on an opponent, it's going to add a 0.25 modifier to that attack. So what that means is it's the equivalent of giving your attack plus 25 slash attack, for example, which is pretty good. I mean, it's not amazing, especially if it's a high modifier attack, right? It's definitely going to be more beneficial to land a critical hit on a lower modifier attack because the overall damage is going to be increased more. However, plus 0.25 is still nothing to kind of snub your nose at, especially when you consider that, you know, for some characters, getting a critical hit is pretty easy. And that, you know, that could be the difference between getting Kaiser Knuckles for Tifa and going Assault Knuckles for Tifa. The difference being Assault Knuckles has plus 39 more attack, right? And so you're kind of faced with the option, at what point is that 39 attack better than a plus 25 crit? And the answer is difficult to say, but if that plus 25 crit and you're running Tifa on a crit build, and you're running Tifa with like 2 Bs, VC in the party, so she gets a plus 0.25 critical damage modifier, so that whenever she critical hits, then it would be adding a plus 0.50 modifier, right? It could potentially be a lot more worth it, right? And a lot of the times, a 0.25 modifier is going to be better than attack plus 39 on a weapon, unless you're not critical hitting, right? And there are a bunch of characters who might not be built for critical hits, and there are a bunch of characters who are, right? Tidus, for example, Tifa, Cloud, they're going to be critical hitting, so you can fit that critical damage on them. So that is basically what adding critical damage does. Now, the question, of course, being, right, now that we know what critical damage is there ever a situation where you stack critical damage over slash attack? The answer is no. So slash attack is going to be universal. Elemental attack is going to be universal. So these things, so like if you had a choice between plus 35 critical hit damage and plus 35 slash attack, you would always choose the plus 35 slash attack because it's going to modify your damage the same, and it's going to be guaranteed all the time. Conditionally, where you may want to think about it is with things like Maneater, things like Aquatic Killer, where those aren't always 100% of the time, and maybe you'll have more of an opportunity to deal more damage by investing in critical damage in those situations. Some other things you might think about as well is the idea of Shinra Bangle, Tidus Necklace, Tidus Boots, critical damage gear occupying slots that normally don't have a modifier in them, right? You know, that is big, right? Being able to equip Tidus's necklace as a, you know, accessory that's really good magic resistance, but also gives a modifier to Tidus or a modifier to whatever critical damage unit is using it is huge, right? Because that's another slot where you could potentially get more modifiers for damage where you couldn't really get any modifiers for damage before. And of course, this is changing with like Galmia Cloak for mage units, right? Where, you know, the plus 30% magic is probably going to be better for them. But it's one of those things where you really have to know what you're doing. You have to have an understanding of how vision cards operate, an understanding of how critical hit rate works, what your character's critical hit rate is, and how critical damage works in order to optimize it. And nobody is ever going to be able to say definitively that this critical hit rate piece of gear is the best, right? Because depending on what type of a character you're running, what type of a composition you're running, the assault version could absolutely be better. So the only thing I can do here is educate you guys and show you guys what critical damage is and kind of go from there. Now, what am I thinking about critical damage? When I think about critical damage, I think about 5-man compositions, because most of the time when you're running a 3-man composition, your vision cards are not going to be critical damage focused, with some exceptions, right? But I think about, you know, 5-man compositions where you have a 5th VC and you want to modify your party's damage, but you're not sure, you know, what the best way to do that is, right? And this could be one of those situations where you go, okay, well, maybe I actually set a plus dex card, right? And, or maybe I'm running Ildira, okay? Maybe I'm running Ildira in a party with water units, and I have Ildira with Moore's VC on. Moore's VC, of course, gives critical damage up to the party, and water magic attack, but maybe they don't need that water magic attack, right? So maybe I set Ildira's VC to give dex up to make sure my units crit more so that more units get that 0.25 modifier, as opposed to doing something like, I don't know, something else. So, I mean, there's just so many layers to think about with critical damage. I really don't think you have to worry about it if you're like a newer player really stressed out about this. You don't have to worry about it unless you are like extremely trying to optimize a 5-man build, I believe. You can, of course, have critical hit damage shenanigans with like Cloud and Tifa potentially and Aerith. And, you know, that's great. That's fun. But it's not going to be the end of the world if you don't fully understand this video. There is a whole bunch of gear here and VCs that we can talk about. There's not much critical damage gear out there right now. Tidus's necklace, Shinra's bangle coming out next week is going to be best in slot with that plus 10 defense pen. Tidus's boots give plus 30 critical damage. And then you have a whole bunch of other VCs that give critical damage as well. Probably what surprised me was that Marlith gives a generic plus 18, which I didn't know. The only one not listed here is Will of the Strongest, I believe, because I don't think that VC is particularly relevant. But Snow White Guard is a great example of maybe you want to set a defensive vision card, but you also want to increase your damage capability. So maybe, you know, you're setting Snow White Guard and you're running Rob in your composition, and Rob, of course, is a crit-based unit. So maybe you go Deadly Mastery on Rob with Virtuous Contract for plus 20 crit, and then all of a sudden Rob is going to have a plus 18 additional modifier that he previously would not have had, right? So things like this are kind of like the complicated aspects that you have to think about with critical damage. Very similar with ice units here, right? Plus 13 crit damage. You know, if you can get an ice unit to potentially have very high dexterity, dark units are the same, right? Dark units in particular here, we do have a dark vision card for Venero, which does boost dark dexterity plus 35%. That means a lot of those units are going to be critting. It could be potentially very viable if you're running a 5 VC situation to set this VC for critical damage. Let's say you're running like a composition with your dark units that's not just slash, right? Let's say you're throwing Kane in there, and you want to modify their damage because they have like slash, pierce, different setups, and maybe you have Ziza for fisting, or for striking. So yeah, I mean, in that situation, maybe adding the dark unit plus 25 critical damage could actually net you more damage than setting another vision card. Of course, you're no matter what going to set Diablos, right? Because that's a dark attack up for the party. But in terms of, maybe you have to run the Venera VC, so then you could run this VC as well for that plus 25 critical damage. 2B VC plus 25 critical damage. 2B's VC is unique because you're always setting it, right? If you're running 2B, you're always setting 2B's VC, which means the wind units that are running with 2B are going to lend themselves towards critical hits more, because essentially the critical hit modifier is doubled to a 0.50. So of course, landing that critical hit is very powerful, right? Because there's very few things that can modify by plus 0.50 in the game, just as a whole. I think about Lucia coming out and Lucia's VC that she has, which also gives plus 70 dexterity to Lucia. And I'm thinking Lucia to be Tifa potentially for a crit wind build. A couple people were asking why I didn't talk a lot about the other wind archer. I can't remember his name right now, Corwell, that came out, and that's because I don't know necessarily that Corwell lends himself towards a critical hit build. I think Lucia is going to be more aimed towards it, but you could put Lucia's VC, if you were going to run Corwell, you could put Lucia's VC on Corwell and potentially get some nice damage there. And then of course, Glaciela's VC has water units plus 25 critical damage. Unfortunately, there's not very many water pierce units you're going to run this with, but hold out for the future. Maybe when Glaciela EX comes out and people are kind of running some different compositions, maybe we'll get like a GL water pierce units coming in the future. You never know. Anyway, guys, we are at the end of the video. I hope you all found this useful. Critical damage to me is just one of those fun things in the game, very similar to critical hit rate, where I just love talking about it. I love kind of making critical damage builds and messing with it. If you guys do want to support me, make sure you use my affiliate link, dig.gs/coins, and show up to my streams. Drop me a subscribe, drop me a like, become a YouTube member. It all helps. Thank you so much, guys, and have a great rest of your day.